can see my screen up. Okay, thank you. Thank you again for that introduction, and thank you all for having me here with you again today. Before we dive in, I just wanted to take a moment and acknowledge the fact that for many of us, our thoughts are with our Afghani brothers and sisters and what they're dealing with through this transition. We may be feeling heavy as we think about our Haitian brothers and sisters dealing with the devastation from the recent earthquake. And of course, we're thinking about Delta here in Colorado and throughout the world. So I know that we bring into this session and this day a bit of heaviness, concern for our country, for our world. And if you're comfortable, I would just invite you to join me in closing your eyes, taking a few of those deep breaths that were mentioned that you learned about from a previous speaker, and sending whatever form of positivity out into the world that you may send. So whether that's a prayer, a mantra, just a moment to settle within yourself, positive vibes, whatever it is that works for you. If we can collectively, as an AAUW conference, send some positivity out into our world, I think it would feel good for us, and I believe that it would be felt by the world. So again, I'm just going to invite you to close your eyes. Take those deep breaths. And as we embark on this conversation about positivity, I thank you because I needed that moment as well. Again, my name is Drew Houston. I am joining you from Citizens Project, where I am the executive director. However, conversations about DEI and social justice and things of that nature have been my passion for quite some time prior to joining Citizens Project. So I'm very excited to be here, and I thank you again for having me. Let's see here. There we go. As mentioned last time, we talked about why diversity, equity, and inclusion now. And I just included this slide as an example of some of what we discussed last time. Feedback that I received was that this was kind of the favorite slide. And so I wanted to give those who wanted to see it again, and maybe those who had not seen it before, just the opportunity to see this slide. I certainly cannot take credit for it, but it is one of my favorites for this conversation as well. It's available online, and I would be happy to share it with anyone who may like it. I can share from my personal stock as well. I walked away from that conversation last time very confident that AAUW Colorado was clear on why diversity, equity, and inclusion now. As I sat and thought about an organization that has been in existence for 140 years, I thought about the necessity of being aware of times as they change and being willing to pivot. And it's very impressive that AAUW has done so and recognize that as we continue to work toward equity and equality for women and girls, specifically in education, it was time to branch out and broaden the mission to include DEI. As I spoke with Ms. Joan Brown about what we would talk about this time, we came up with practical thoughts on promoting positive togetherness. And I'm going to give myself a pat on the back for getting through that. You can all try with your mics on mute to try to say that a few times fast, especially before 10 a.m. And what Ms. Joan Brown described that to me as was the nuts and bolts of having some of these conversations and of getting the work done. You know, we've moved from understanding why the change is necessary to implementing the work. And so how do we do that? I actually could not find a picture of nuts and bolts, surprisingly enough, but I did find this nice picture of people who look like they are feeling pretty positive and they are together. I wanted to first start by acknowledging a page that I am sure most of you are very familiar with at this point. As I prepared for this conversation today, I spent a lot of time in AAUW's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Toolkit, and it is extensive. Everything from definitions, not just on diversity, equity, and inclusion, but things like neurodiversity, intersectionality, allyship, white supremacy. There are conversation starters, ways to approach these conversations. And as I dug through the toolkit and looked at the agenda for today and looked at what we would be hearing from some of our communities who are already doing such great work, it occurred to me that perhaps the nuts and bolts are already there. It seems a bit presumptive of me to feel like I can tell anyone who with access to and experience with such an amazing toolkit that's been provided, as well as some of the information that you are already implementing. I'm looking forward to hearing about fundraising and things of that nature. How can I presume to have nuts and bolts or practicality to share? I did not want to be that presumptuous. And so I thank you for your time. I hope you've all enjoyed working with your toolkit, and I wish that everyone's camera was on so I could see Stormy or Joan's face, but that's just a little bit of a joke. What I will say is that the nuts and bolts are there, and it's evidenced by the work that's already being done. And so I just want to applaud everyone for where we are right now. And so without permission, I did not ask permission. I am asking forgiveness at this point, but I did make a slight change. And I thought, perhaps I can provide a few impractical thoughts. Perhaps there are things that, are not necessarily nuts and bolts, that don't necessarily come innately, that can be useful and beneficial to implementing and continuing this amazing work. And so I would like to just share very informally about some of the impracticalities that are useful in this work. And I apologize, this will be the most wordy slide. But as I prepared, and I'm moving the thumbnail so I can see the slide, as I prepared and thought about that, this is one of the quotes that stood out the most to me from your own toolkit. And it just says, as you've all probably read, AAUW is dedicated to helping members become more comfortable sharing their perspectives outside of diversity trainings, and to address diversity, equity, and inclusion in all aspects of their work and lives. We seek to encourage ongoing dialogue that will inspire all members to bring these values to their personal and professional interactions. Excuse me. And what I gleaned from this quote was something that I was trained in as a community organizer. So prior to my current role, I spent time as a community organizer. And one of the most important things we talk about in community organizing is relationship building. And part of that relationship building is storytelling. The last time I was with you, for those of you who were at the spring conference, you'll remember I shared personal stories for each of the areas. I shared when I saw a lack of inclusion and how that impacted me and what I thought that must have impacted the people who were experiencing it. I shared my first interaction and realization that I could make a positive change in our community. And that, what I hope I was able to convey doing so, was the power of storytelling. Of course, for me, and probably for a lot of us, when we think of storytelling, the first thing we think of is those lovely bedtime stories we used to ask for as children, or perhaps the ones you tell your children or grandchildren. For me, it's my niece and nephew. At this point, they humor me by allowing me to tell them stories. They're a bit older now, but storytelling is so much more than that. We need only to think about the popularity of TED Talks and their impact. We need only to think about our earliest forms of communication. We need only to think about how you may have been impacted by stories you've heard and how they've stayed with you, to recognize that so much more comes from storytelling than entertainment. It's how we convey our history, our experience, can be used for marketing. It's what conjures up the emotion that drives the passion for the type of work that we're going to be doing together. DEI work is not always easy, as I'm sure we're all experiencing together, especially when we're learning to do so remotely. But the passion that these stories can ignite is what keeps us all going. It's our personal narratives. And so I want to just encourage each of you to begin thinking of your own personal stories and how those can impact your work and your opportunity to build relationships with new members and community collaborators and things of that nature. For me, when it comes to this work, I have watershed moments that come to mind, in the blink of an eye. I can think of my first experience with advocacy. I can think of when I first realized, though I had not experienced them, I know when I realized that there were injustices in this world that needed to be addressed. I can think of my very first win, my very first victory in the DEI or social justice field. Those things come to mind, and they bring, even now, they bring emotion to me as I think about those things. Excuse me. And when it comes to DEI, because this is a new mission or a new addition for AAUW, perhaps those moments have not occurred yet for some of you. Perhaps they have. And now I'll excuse the car that's passing by. But what I would encourage is that whether they've occurred or not, the important thing about this story is that you are the hero of your own story. And so as you're out and about experiencing day to day, just remembering that you are the hero in the story, and that's what brings these stories to life. I look forward to the day when we can meet like this and exchange information together. I would love to hear some of the stories that you all have that are probably coming to mind right now as you think about DEI or as you think about your passions. One other thing about storytelling, or part of knowing your own story, involves knowing the definitions. And again, the toolkit has such amazing and useful definitions for everything. What I thought the next step might be, or the impractical step might be, when we think about those definitions and how they apply to your own story, is knowing what those definitions mean to you. What do they mean on a day-to-day basis? How have you seen them come to life? And so I will share a story about the definition of equity. And this occurred during work as a community organizer. Often organizers do what are called windshield tours, which is essentially just driving around, exactly like it sounds, taking things in through the view of your windshield. What looks different? What's the difference between the grocery store on this side of town versus that side of town? And this particular story was shared with me and has stuck with me. So this organizer was working with a group of youth, and they were doing a windshield tour, and they had extended it specifically to parks. Again, keep in mind, we're talking about equity here. So they had gone from park to park all across the city of Colorado Springs and taken in different things. They were making notes. They were going to do a big project at the end. And this organizer had a conversation with a young lady at the end of the day. And she asked her, we've been doing this. What are you working on? What are you thinking about as far as your project goes? Tell me, what does equity mean? And the young lady responded, cauliflower rice. And the organizer shared with me that she thought, whoa, we are way off. I'm not sure what we've been talking about, but cauliflower rice? So she said, tell me a little bit more. And the young lady shared that as they were at the park that is in her neighborhood, she heard parents talking about making sure their children did not step on a used needle. She heard parents talk about making sure their children were not in the park after certain hours, because that's when drug deals would be taking place. And as they expanded their windshield tour and got out and went to different parks, the young lady shared that what she heard parents talking about as they pushed their strollers around was their favorite cauliflower rice recipe. And to her, to this young lady, those two conversations highlighted and explained equity in a way that a slide, a definition, a formal conversation, things of that nature never could. And I believe that young lady has carried that definition of equity with her. I certainly carry it with me, and it wasn't even a conversation that I had. And so what I hope I'm illustrating is not only the power of story, but the power of making the definitions meaningful within ourselves and within our own personal stories. The next practical, but perhaps not nuts and bolts level practical thought I wanted to touch briefly on was just bringing it home. As I sat and listened to the introduction this morning, I'm so impressed with AAUW and the advocacy you all do on a legislative basis, the bills that you take stances on, and things of that nature. That is a major part of my work with Citizens Project as well. And my thought is that we have a lot of aligning values in the things that we take stances on. Outside of those very specific bills and things of that nature, I think about, how do I bring this work home? What does this mean to me personally? There is a school district in Colorado Springs right now who has recently banned the teaching of critical race theory. That is not a bill that Citizens Project has the opportunity to advocate either pro or against. But it is something that has to do with equity, inclusion, justice, education. When I looked at the things that AAUW is focusing on through the lens of DEI, we talk about education and workplace equity, economic equity and the gender pay gap, leadership equity and seeing more women and girls in positions of leadership. When we look at education, I would just pose a question: is the banning of teaching a specific part of history, is that equitable? Is it inclusive? For me at Citizens Project, the question is, does that seem like educational justice? And so, although it may not be one of the major legislative things that we have an opportunity to advocate on, I bring it home. I think about the fact that my niece said to me, she's actually just started her first year at UCCS just this week, but when she was a freshman in high school taking world history, she said, it's called world history, but we don't talk about the whole world. There's so much missing. And so when I make those two connections, which I hope I'm making clearly, between the history that's being taught already missing some pieces, and now aspects of history being banned, for me, that is bringing it home. It may not be that for you, but I do believe that every single day in our communities, there are issues that are surrounding equity, diversity, inclusion, that are surrounding education, which AAUW is obviously very involved in and focused on, that are surrounding economic equity. I heard the talk about how we have many people who have lost jobs, who have lost their reserves, even technological equity. Are there members who are perhaps having a hard time connecting? Are there members out there, or I'm sorry, potential members who would love to be a part of this, but as we move from what we thought was the end of the pandemic into what seems like the next phase of it, is there enough bandwidth in their rural town in order to be able to connect to the internet and participate in things like this? You know, the bringing it home not only reignites the passion, but if you look at everything through this lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion, there are so many areas for us to address on a daily basis, just in our, as that quote from the website stated, not only in our professional lives, but just in our day-to-day lives and conversations. So the impractical tip or reminder, because I'm quite certain that members are already doing a wonderful job at this, is just to look at ways to bring it home. What does this mean personally? And how can you personally make a change? And I chuckled, I chuckled earlier when there was a share about a professional speaker who spoke to you already about mindfulness and who spoke to you about taking those 10-second vacations. That impacts a bit of my share, because what I wanted to highlight as a potentially impractical thought is that we have to take care of ourselves first. You cannot pour from an empty cup. And a quote from a book I'm reading, looks like it did not get, there it is. The current book I'm reading is called My Grandmother's Hands, and it talks about healing trauma and mending our hearts and bodies as the pathway to achieving social justice and things of that nature. It's a very interesting read, and it makes a lot of sense. And so the impractical piece, the last impractical piece that I wanted to share, is potentially the most practical, and that we need to take care of ourselves first and foremost. As a former social worker, one of the areas I was trained in was trauma-informed care. And that essentially meant looking at every single one of our clients without knowing their backstory or their history, as someone who had experienced some form of trauma, as most of us have. And I believe that that is an important way to look at our approach and our conversations in DEI as well. There's a movement in DEI right now, and the type of work that we're doing to join not only our educational minds, to not only use our intellect, but to use our energy, to use our positivity, to use our bodies to work on how we can positively impact the spaces around us. You know, if you bring a sense of calm into some of these conversations that may not necessarily be very calm, that potentially are uncomfortable, your sense of calm impacts the sense of calm that people that you're conversing with have. One of my favorite questions as we have some of these tough conversations is, are you uncomfortable or are you in danger? There is a human nature response often when we have uncomfortable conversations. Our deepest level of biological survival kicks in, and that fight or flee response kicks in, and we often want to flee from these conversations. And we have to remind ourselves, you know, I'm not in any danger. It might feel like that, but I'm not. I'm just uncomfortable. And so finding ways to take care of ourselves, those 10-second breaks, those 10-second breathers, managing our energy, managing what we bring home and what we choose to lay at the feet of the following day. Things of that nature really impact how we're able to show up and how we're able to do the work. Again, I chuckled as that highlight was mentioned. That was before I had the opportunity to begin sharing and joining in with AAUW. So I don't want to be redundant or repetitive. So that does impact some of my sharing. But that was the note that I wanted to end on, is that one of the most important things we can do in this work, and one of the things that makes this work so much fun, is we find new, innovative, mindful ways to take care of ourselves. And in that way, we can then take care of the world. And so with that said, that was my brief presentation. I just wanted to share my contact information if anyone needed to reach me. Certainly check out our website or feel free to email me. And then I believe we have a couple moments to open up for questions if there are any. And again, I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Drew. That was just a wonderful presentation. Once again, you have done just an outstanding job for us. I'm encouraging people to start using the Q&A box for questions, but I will start with one question for you. And many of our branches are small and have very limited resources. If a branch can only focus on one thing, what's the one thing that they should try to focus on to make a difference relative to diversity and equity?
Oh, that, Carolyn, is a tough one to answer. I don't think that the answer would be the same for every branch. One of the things, and often my mind goes back to my community organizer training. So my first thought is, root cause analysis. What are we seeing in the community? I would suggest perhaps opening up that question to community members and then seeing if there were a way to address the community's thoughts there. If there is not response from community, perhaps the one thing might be education and outreach, allowing the community to know that these are the new mission and values, and this is how we would love for people to get involved.
Well, I have another question too, and that has to do with, just take an example, the political situation that we have now in this country. It just kind of seems like it's us and them kind of thing, depending on your side of the fence. And are there ways to try to work with people that we really disagree with their thought process or their thoughts or their beliefs? What is something we can do when we encounter people on a daily basis to try to interact with them in a much more positive kind of way?
That is certainly something that I experience personally, and that Citizens Project experiences as an organization. For Citizens Project and also for AAUW, I know that part of that safety net lies in our nonpartisanship. So at the end of the day, it's not about an us or them. It is about a value. One thing that we try to do is be a place where conversations can be had. And I personally feel that growth does not happen in a comfort zone. So I encourage the uncomfortable conversations. I try to partner not only with organizations that align with us, but if we have people in other organizations that typically may align differently, if a leader from that organization says, Citizens Project or Drew has some different thoughts, but deep down she's a good person, let's just have a conversation. And we can convene two groups who perhaps are not aligned politically or value-wise. Often we find that we do have more in common than we have not in common. And I always fall back on one of my favorite rappers, Sean Carter. He in a song said, "Men lie, women lie, numbers don't." So it's very easy to fall back on opinions and all of the heated debates that are happening. But when you take that stuff away, what do the facts say? I saw a very interesting tweet the other day from a teacher, and one of the hot topics I'm sure we're all aware of right now is critical race theory. And the teacher said a parent approached him and said, "I want to know if you're going to be teaching my kid that critical race theory." And I think there were some expletives involved as well. And the teacher said, "Well, tell me what that is, and I'll let you know if that's what I'm teaching." The parent didn't have a response. The parent was so up in arms about what he had heard this means and what it means if your student is learning it. but he had no idea what it was. And I think if we pull away some of the filler or the fluff or the blustering and the emotion behind so many of the things that we are approaching in these conversations and look simply at the facts. What is the definition? What do the numbers say? What are we even talking about right now? Outlining those things first, it really does pave the way for just direct conversation rather than the butting of the heads that comes from the opinions that have been formed without fact.
I have a question here from Mary Korch, and she says, can you give examples of how you take care of yourself through mindfulness?
Absolutely. That is it's very helpful for me. I love the thought that the previous speaker, and I apologize for not remembering her name, shared about the breathing technique. That is something that we actually share with each summer, the incoming class of Air Force Academy cadets. They take essentially a life skills class. And that's something that we share with them, is the exact breathing technique that was outlined previously. Just making sure to take those deep breaths in, hold for a few pauses, and then the breathe out. What I share with my cadets is you always have your lungs with you. Sometimes we're like, oh, I don't have my journal. I don't have a pen. I don't have time to do yoga, whatever the practice is. The bottom line is you always have your lungs with you, and you can always take a moment to breathe. And I think that is the very first, most foundational part of any mindfulness practice. I'm trying not to go too deep into my own personal practices, but journaling. I will, and I do have a book list I'm happy to share, but I am just blown away by this book here, which is on the book list as well. I'm not finished with it, but it really talks about healing our hearts and bodies on the path to racial reconciliation is what this book focuses on in our country. But recognizing that our bodies are impacted by everything we do, and then in turn impact everything. So focusing on being the most healthy version of ourselves, I think is a very important part of any mindful practice.
Do you do that on a periodic basis or more as the need demands, or how do you decide when you want to practice some mindfulness?
I try to practice it continually, but my body will tell me when, you know what, you need to just breathe for a moment. When I find myself growing frustrated or overly, prior to coming on with you all this morning, prior to hitting camera on, I was taking deep breaths and kind of trying to ground myself in this moment. Technology at this point also helps. I have my Apple Watch, and it goes off and says, take a moment to breathe. And I have it set for how many deep breaths I want to take in a minute. So, but our bodies let us know. Another great book is Our Bodies Keep the Score. That's not a DEI book, but more of a mindfulness book. And they certainly let us know when we start feeling that heart racing feeling, when we're in traffic thinking we're going to be late, and I don't want to move into the frustration. I just want to accept this moment. We feel it. So as long as we recognize and react to it in that way.
Well, I'm going to encourage the group, if anyone has any other questions that they would like to ask. I don't see any in the Q&A box right now. I guess I have one more. And what's the next step with the Citizen Project? What are you focusing on right now that may be different than what we've heard in the past?
what we're focusing on right now is school board elections are coming up. And so our civic engagement and education has always told us that local elections are very important. And so we will continue to focus on that. What may be different than you've heard in the past is an additional education piece. I think it's very important because Citizens Project has a reputation in our community and people trust us, that we be a resource for the kinds of fact-based definitions that we spoke about earlier, Carolyn. We're currently planning just a conversation on critical race theory because it is one of those hot button topics and people may not know what it means or where it came from. So I would love for people to know that they can come to Citizens Project, not for an opinion on pro or con for critical race theory necessarily, but they can come to Citizens Project to find out what that means and then determine what aligns most with their values and how to move in that way. So we're really going to be looking in the near future to ramp up our education aspect. We've always said civic engagement and education, and I think we do a great job of engaging with our community. We also want to make sure that our voice is one that consistently educates as well.
Okay, a question from Jill Smith. How can organizations reach out to be inclusive with other organizations?
That is that is something that Citizens Project is working on as well. And I think it's probably due to something that AAUW members face. We are a very small staff at Citizens Project, and we have great big dreams of all the work we want to get done. And so recognizing, I think, that whatever it is that your organization is focused on, there is another organization and or group of volunteers who are also interested in that. I think approaching collaboration with a sense of humility is very important. Often there's a question of whose name is going to be first on the, on the little card that goes out or whatever the case may be. Approaching it as in, it doesn't matter who's getting the credit for this, as long as the work gets done, elevating the importance of the work over the importance of the credit, I believe, is the best way. And there are many resources. I would ask what organization the person who asked the question is thinking about, but Colorado Roundtable comes to mind for nonprofits. Different grants have groups meeting and you find people there, but whatever it is you're focused on, there is another organization who is also focused on it. So any opportunity for collaboration, likely Citizens Project as well. So please keep us in mind too, especially for things that have to do with DEI. And for us, it's equity, inclusion, and justice. Those umbrellas are certainly very, very similar. So, and we'd like to collaborate as much as possible.
And then I have one last question here, and that's from Donna Nielsen, is how can we get your book list?
I put it up here and I'm happy to, would it be best to send to Joan or Stormy? This is a smaller version that I thought was appropriate for DEI conversations. A lot of mine have more social justice and racial justice leanings, but these books that I left up here on this particular list, I did narrow down to those that have more of a DEI focus, and I'm happy to send this list on for Joan or Stormy or someone to share throughout the network.
That would be good, I think.
Okay.
It'll also be in the recording, but it might be nice to have it in hand.
Absolutely.
Okay. Does anyone in the audience have any other questions that they would like to ask of Drew? Okay, so now I believe I hand this back off to Joan to come up. Wait a minute, just a minute. Oh, Mary Corch says, thank you very much.
Thank
So,
you
and
all very
But
much.
I think Joan Brown is going to come back on. So Joan, if you'll turn your